It opens up a series of questions about the canon and about translation. If we imagine that language is somehow the window onto a realm of being or thought, ways of inhabiting or conceptualizing a world, and so that therefore we need to read Chinese or Persian or Zulu or whatever in order to gain access to the very philosophical possibilities and potentialities that inhere in others, but that are only accessible in their languages, then we're always limited by the limits of translation or the time it takes to learn the language, or what in a kind of commonly understood model is the idea that the native speaker will always speak it better. And of course, this was a colonial problem. We can't really understand the native because we can't ever get there. We can't ever arrive. We can't ever get inside the native's head. But we impose the same problem on ourselves if we imagine that by now choosing a set of African languages and ensuring that everybody becomes conversant in 2 of them or 3 of them, if we imagine that thereby we give ourselves instantly access to a whole set of philosophical resources that reside in those languages. That seems to me to, and on the other hand, if we choose, no, we should change the curriculum by giving people texts in translation from all over the world, well, how are we going to choose them, and how are we going to skirt the problem that part of us thinks that the translation always then reinserts the forms of thought that English, say, is going to impose on it, and therefore we have just a bastardized version of what those modes of thought actually are. So another limitation. What does this imply for what we might want to champion? Well, that's why I wish I'd gone before Gabriel and Achille, because I think both of them in different ways would say that one first has to abandon, one still has to mothball, as it were, a set of understandings about language. And among linguists now, in any case, a lot of this has been abandoned, but I don't think among people who are thinking about decolonizing the university, they have been abandoned at all. I think what one wants to say is that, to some extent, all languages are practices. They bleed at the edges, if indeed they have any edges. It's in the processes, the ongoing processes of realization that real talk and real thought happens, it's constantly being reinvented. And that's how we must kind of project forward a future for our scholarship, and we must find all of the sorts of ways of supporting that we can, including the kind that's been admirably demonstrated here.
Sorry, Eric, for putting you in this position. It's like the old joke about the third wife of Henry VIII wondering what she could do that was different. The question that I want to...
It's just how I think.
But I think some of the questions that you've raised are both interesting, but also I think they are very open-ended. So the first question is, which language is it to be? And the colonial masters in India and elsewhere were faced with the same problem. Which is the master language that allows us to address the native, access that hidden tradition and so on? And that is indeed one of the ironies of the post-colonial condition, that we are haunted, as you put it, by that question. The second question is the problem of language, where I think very often this question of language and knowledge is rendered as where people say, well, I don't know Arabic, I don't know Persian, I don't know X language, I don't know Y language, which is really an argument from lethargy, because none of us read Marx in German, we don't read Merleau-Ponty in French, nor do we read Seneca in Latin, we read it in English translation. So there is a way in which there is a pragmatic relation to language, as Achille puts it, where we can use this language to access. So I don't know Persian or Arabic, but I'm reading scholars who do. And that allows me access to those ideas. So one has to have a pragmatic relation to the idea of language and access as well. And finally, with this question of colonialism, when I was a graduate student, there was a wonderful scholar called Ganesh Devi, who went as a graduate student to do a degree in English literature. And he was told to read F.R. Lewis. Now, any diet of F.R. Lewis, as you know, puts you in literature for life. But so then he said, why am I reading all of this? Doesn't India have traditions of literary and aesthetic criticism? So he wrote a wonderful book that influenced me when I was a graduate, which was called After Amnesia. And there is a way in which colonialism had wrought an amnesia where it's almost as if when you enter university, you don't believe that you have anything to bring to the university. There's only something that the university has to give to you. And so that question of colonialism, of after amnesia, of what we have forgotten, and what we need to recover, and the means to recovery of language, which language, all of these are the complex cluster of questions I think we can again have been circulating. And I don't think it's not that we've kind of overwhelmed you. You brought some very fundamental questions to the table, including the question of why we think the way we do, right? Which is the question of colonialism, which I don't think we really took on board very seriously. And David, and then we'll open to the...
Well, I've been struck at how very different these, very different directions that we've all moved in, or even my predecessors have moved in. And I guess I'm going to provide another direction into these issues. I was taken by Achille's comment about languages as libraries, because what I'm going to be talking about is an effort that was made back in the 1970s at the Social Science Research Council in New York for plumbing the depths of languages and the conceptual worlds that are structured in those languages in South Asia, to seek the new knowledge that was in those libraries. Knowledge which was not familiar in the Western canon at that time. And this was specific to a committee on South Asia. It was an interdisciplinary committee of researchers in the humanities and social sciences, based at the Social Science Research Council, and I was the staff person to this committee. And just as a bit of background, the Social Science Research Council and the American Council of Learned Societies, these two organizations which go back to the 1920s, and which quite adamantly and systematically insisted upon interdisciplinarity. Even back in the 1920s, people were concerned about the fact that the disciplines were producing silos of knowledge which did not address one another. And the SSRC and the ACLS were explicitly constructed and funded by Rockefeller Foundation and subsequently Ford Foundation, Carnegie, and various private foundations. These are not government bodies, these are private bodies, to encourage and be the venue for interdisciplinary discussions of intellectual issues, practical issues, policy issues, wide variety of issues, but bringing together quite explicitly the linguist, the economist, the historian, the anthropologist, the literary scholar, because the presumption has constantly been, or the commitment of these two institutions, that the world is much too complicated, and real issues are much too complicated to be settled or resolved by single disciplines. That there has to be a variety of approaches, kind of like what's happening here on this stage. I came to this myself as a consequence of first immersing myself in Italy, studying sculpture and art history in a world very different from anything I knew from growing up in New York City. And then spending a couple of years teaching in an elementary school in the Philippines, where again I was immersed in another world which wasn't mine, and I had to sort of try to figure out what the language was and what the meanings of what was seen to be common sense among the people that I was working with, which didn't seem common sense to me at all. Then I ended up doing a PhD in cultural anthropology at the University of Chicago, and worked very closely with Clifford Geertz, who was his last Southeast Asia student, so I was invested again with his imagination and his approach to understanding cultural systems in their whole and in their unique quality and their unique characteristics. That followed, I finished that in 1970, and instead of going for an academic position, of which there were, fortunately at that point, many available in anthropology, I joined the Ford Foundation to work as a social sciences and humanities program officer in the Philippines and then in Southeast Asia generally. I spent 5 years there. And this is what I'm coming to. What was so striking to me was the dismay, the anger, the discomfort of so many of the scholars that I was meeting in Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, with what to do with what they had learned in the American universities or the European universities that they had attended. It didn't seem to mesh, it didn't seem to work with what they were seeing on the ground, what the issues were that people on the ground that they were trying to write about, whether they were sociologists or anthropologists or historians or linguists. There was some traction from the Western canon that they had learned in the various universities, but they were constantly feeling it isn't enough, it isn't quite right, it isn't getting at what they wanted. And my role in this was to try to put together small projects which people could begin to explore these issues a little bit more on the staff of the foundation. This was 5 years, and in 1975, I was asked to join the American Social Science Research Council, based in New York, to form two committees which had not existed at the time. One on Southeast Asia, a research committee on Southeast Asia, and a research committee on South Asia. Most of my own work had been in Southeast Asia, that I was just describing a moment ago. And I had done a certain amount of work in South Asia as a graduate student, but that was new territory for me, really. What I was instructed to do was to put together a research agenda for these two committees. And that was my mandate. And I spent much of the second half of 1975 visiting universities in the US and visiting then universities in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, talking with people about, all right, we've got research committees with a small amount of funding, but enough to do some interesting projects. What would you see to be, what would you think would be interesting, useful projects that are not getting done now, and that this interdisciplinary approach to project development could contribute to? Again, in the US, to my surprise, there was the same kind of angst. This is the mid-1970s in the United States. Scholars of South Asia, scholars of Southeast Asia were equally troubled by the American canon. The Weber, Durkheim, Freud. At that time, Claude Lévi-Strauss was just sort of coming into fashion. There was no Marx. Marx had been precluded from the American academy ever since the early 1950s because of the McCarthy scare. And no one was getting trained in Marxism. Marxism was simply not on the curriculum at all. It only came in the late 60s with the student movements. But this is and it was just getting started in the late 60s. And the senior scholars who had worked in those parts of the world had not been trained in Marx and had no interest in, no knowledge of Marx, quite literally. So it was Weber, Durkheim, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Freud, and as I said, some of losing it, Lévi-Strauss. The one person who seemed to have the most generative and the most thoughtful suggestions about how to proceed in coming to some kind of understanding of how to deal with cultures, systems of knowledge, conceptual worlds other than our own, was a man by the name of A.K. Ramanujan, who was a professor of linguistics and social thought at the University of Chicago, a poet and a translator. And Raman, as he was known, really became a central figure in my life and in the life of these two committees, in effect, for the next 5 years. And what Raman argued for and generated projects around was the importance of really looking in depth, and very seriously, at the folklore, at the poetry, at the philosophy, at the religious concepts, legal concepts, and of daily life, for what the conceptual worlds were that were embedded in the languages, in the daily experience of people in South Asia, and it moved over into Southeast Asia as well. And he created an ambient kind of a setting for people to gather around various topics and various themes, to really try to dig deeply into what we could find there. What is it in these languages which is not easily translatable or has not yet been translated into English as tools for social analysis, tools for cultural analysis. That was really what he was pressing for, and that we were pressing, and that the community of these two committees were pressing for. The South Asia Committee, starting in 1976 and running until about 1983, 84, when things began to change, and I'll get to that in a minute, came up with 4 different domains for exploration of concepts which would enable the generation of new knowledge. One of them was karma and rebirth. Karma and rebirth are taken as sort of nonsensical or absurd notions in the West. The notion of rebirth of a person as a concept in a form that results from the prior behavior in prior incarnations simply doesn't make sense in most Western terms. And yet it obviously it was tremendously important for very large proportions of the Indian population, and affected how they thought about themselves, how they thought about their families, how they thought about their social relationships. It was something which made no sense on one scale, and in another register made an enormous amount of sense. And so what we put together were a whole series of workshops and conferences bringing people together who thought about these issues. One volume, became a volume, on the philosophical foundations of karma, the philosophical bases of the karma tradition, and the thoughts about rebirth. It turns out there are Buddhist traditions, there are Jain traditions, there are Hindu traditions, there are variations geographically as well, and there were variations over time. And we produced a very interesting book on the different ways that karma and rebirth have been articulated and studied and become part of the intellectual baggage of the South Indian tradition. At the same time, there were a series of projects, individual projects and then collective projects, essentially on karma and rebirth in daily life. How do people actually on the ground, in communities, in families, manifest this understanding of karma and rebirth? What does it mean in their lives? And there were 2 books that came out. One on the sort of the philosophical foundations and variations, and one on the actual implementation of these ideas in people's lives and in communities and societies. The second one that came out, or the second focus